something just became very clear about the direction of the Pittsburgh Steelers defense, and it all starts with the arrival of Brisker and what he represents for this secondary moving forward. When you really listen to what's being said behind the scenes and how he's being talked about, this is not just another addition to fill a spot. This is a player the team fully expects to have a major role right away, and not in a limited way. We're talking about someone who could be on the field for virtually every snap, moving across different alignments, and becoming one of the key chess pieces in this defense. And when you look at Brisker's background, it starts to make even more sense why there's so much confidence in him. This is a player who has already shown he can line up all over the field. He's played in the box, he's played deep, he's handled multiple responsibilities in previous systems, and now he's stepping into a situation where versatility isn't just appreciated, it's required. The Steelers are clearly leaning into a more flexible defensive structure, especially with the increasing use of two high safety looks across the league, and Brisker fits perfectly into that evolution. But here's where things get really interesting. Even with Brisker expected to take on a primary role, possibly as a free safety in many situations, it doesn't solve everything in the secondary. In fact, it actually raises more questions about what the Steelers still need to address, especially when you start thinking about the upcoming draft and the long-term construction of this defense. Because right now, if you're looking at the roster, there are still two major areas that stand out: free safety depth and the slot corner position. And the tricky part is, both feel equally important. There isn't a clear answer as to which one should come first, and that's where the strategy becomes fascinating. Do you prioritize a true slot defender who can lock down the middle of the field? Or do you continue investing in safety help, knowing how often those players are asked to rotate and adapt in modern defenses? What makes this even more complex is the reality of the NFL today. Positions are becoming less defined. It's no longer just about labeling someone as a strong safety or a free safety or a nickel corner. The best defenses are built around players who can do multiple things at a high level, and that's exactly what Brisker emphasized himself. He doesn't want to be boxed into one role. He sees himself as a defensive back who can play anywhere, deep in the box, covering zones, handling man assignments, adjusting to whatever the defense needs in the moment. And if that's the mindset the Steelers are embracing, then it changes how they approach the draft entirely. Instead of looking for specialists, they may be targeting players who can fill multiple roles. A bigger slot corner who can also rotate to safety, a safety who can drop into coverage like a corner. That kind of versatility could become the deciding factor when they're on the clock. Now, there's also a bigger picture element here that can't be ignored. Brisker is on a one-year deal. That means while he could be a huge piece for this season, there's no guarantee he's part of the long-term plan unless things work out and the team decides to keep him. So even though he helps stabilize the defense right now, the Steelers still have to think ahead. They still need to find players who can be part of this secondary for years to come. And that's why this upcoming draft feels so important. It's not just about filling immediate gaps. It's about building a unit that can sustain itself beyond this season, especially when you consider factors like age, contracts, and how quickly things can change in the NFL. The Steelers can't afford to ignore either position. So when you put it all together, Brisker's arrival isn't the final piece. It's more like the start of a bigger shift, a move that gives the defense flexibility, but also demands smarter decisions moving forward. And it puts even more pressure on the front office to get this next step right, especially in a draft class where versatility might be the most valuable trait of all. The big question now is this: if you're in the Steelers' position, knowing everything about this roster and where the league is heading, which would you prioritize first in the draft? A true slot corner or another versatile safety? And that's exactly where the strategy starts to split, because depending on how the Steelers view this draft class, the answer to that question could completely reshape how their first 2 days unfold. There's a growing sense that this isn't a draft where you absolutely have to be aggressive at the very top. In fact, there's a strong argument that the real value sits a little later, especially in that range between the end of the first round and the middle of the second. That's where a lot of teams are seeing clusters of talent with similar grades, and for a team like the Steelers that still has multiple needs, that kind of depth becomes extremely attractive. Now think about this for a second. The Steelers are sitting with a large number of draft picks, more than they realistically can use on players who will actually make the roster. Bringing in too many rookies creates its own problem. You simply won't have room to develop all of them, and some of those picks end up being wasted. So the idea of moving around the board, trading down first, then packaging picks to move back up, starts to make a lot of sense. Imagine this scenario playing out. The Steelers move down from their original first-round position, picking up additional value, and still land a player they like because the talent drop-off isn't that steep in that range. Then, later on, they use some of those extra assets to jump back into a spot where they can target another key piece. It's not just about who you pick, it's about maximizing the value of every selection, and this connects directly back to the secondary discussion. If the board doesn't fall the way you expect early, maybe you don't force a pick at safety or slot corner right away. Maybe you trust the depth of the class and attack it later, while using those premium spots to strengthen other areas like wide receiver, offensive line, or the defensive front. Because let's not forget, this team has needs beyond the secondary. There's a real opportunity to add impact players on offense, especially at wide receiver. Even after adding talent to that room, the numbers and long-term outlook suggest they're far from done. In fact, there's a strong belief that the Steelers could double dip at the position in this draft, grabbing one receiver early who can contribute right away, and then taking another shot later on a high upside prospect, and that's where some really intriguing names start to enter the picture. Players who might not be at the top of every headline, but who bring unique physical traits that are hard to ignore. You're talking about receivers with rare size and speed combinations, guys who turned heads during the pre-draft process with explosive testing numbers, prospects who, before the combine, might have been overlooked but suddenly forced teams to go back, rewatch the tape, and ask themselves if there's more there to develop. This is where smart scouting becomes critical, because these are the types of players who can either become hidden gems or fade away if they're not developed properly. And historically, this is an area where the Steelers have taken calculated risks. Finding value at wide receiver later in the draft is something this organization has done before, and there's a sense they could be setting up to do it again. But here's the key part. All of these decisions are connected. If you double dip at wide receiver, if you move around the board, if you prioritize versatility in the secondary, every move impacts the next. You can't address everything at once, which means there will be tough choices. There will be positions that get pushed down the priority list, at least temporarily, so now it becomes a balancing act. Do you stay disciplined and follow the value of the board, even if it means waiting longer to fix a defensive need? Or do you act aggressively to secure a specific type of player you believe is essential for your system? And maybe the biggest wildcard in all of this is how confident the Steelers truly are in their current pieces. If they believe Brisker can handle a massive role immediately, maybe that buys them time at safety. If they think they can scheme around the slot position with versatile defenders, maybe that becomes less urgent. But if those internal evaluations are even slightly off, it could leave a gap that opposing offenses will attack all season long. That's why this draft feels like more than just adding talent. It's about defining the identity of this team moving forward. Are they going all in on versatility and flexibility? Are they trying to build depth across multiple positions? Or are they targeting specific roles with precision and urgency? Because whichever path they choose, it's going to shape not just this season, but the direction of the franchise over the next few years. So now I want to hear from you. If the Steelers start moving around the draft board and double dip at wide receiver like it's being suggested, are you comfortable waiting longer to address the secondary? Or do you think that's a risk they simply can't afford to take? And if you really take a step back and look at everything that's unfolding, you start to see how this isn't just about one offseason or one draft class. This is about how the Steelers are quietly trying to adapt to where the NFL is going. Defenses are no longer built on rigid roles. The days of having clearly defined positions across the secondary are fading. Offenses are too dynamic, too fast, too creative. If you can't disguise coverages, rotate responsibilities, and adjust on the fly, you get exposed. And that's why a player like Brisker isn't just a good addition. He's almost a necessity for what the game demands now. But with that shift comes pressure, because it's one thing to say you want versatile players, it's another thing to actually find them, develop them, and put them in positions to succeed. Not every prospect can handle multiple roles. Not every player processes the game at that level. So when the Steelers talk about valuing versatility, they're also taking on a more difficult evaluation process. And that's where this draft becomes a real test of the front office. Not just in terms of talent evaluation, but in terms of vision. They need to identify players who don't just fit a position, but who fit a concept. Players who can evolve as the system evolves. Players who won't become limited as soon as offenses adjust. At the same time, they can't ignore immediate impact. This team still has expectations. They still need to compete right now. So there's always that tension between building for the future and solving today's problems. And the best organizations are the ones that find a way to do both without compromising surprising either. That's why every move from here on out feels connected. Every visit, every workout, every trade discussion, it's all part of a bigger puzzle. And when draft night finally arrives, what we'll be watching isn't just who they pick, but how those picks tell the story of what this team wants to become. Because once the draft is over, the conversation completely shifts. It's no longer about projections or possibilities. It becomes about reality. Who is actually on this roster? Who is expected to contribute right away? And which of these decisions are going to be tested the moment the season begins? And that's where everything we've been talking about starts to collide. If the Steelers do wait on the secondary, if they trust that versatility and scheme can hold things together early on, then all eyes are going to be on how quickly those pieces come together. There won't be much patience from the outside if communication breaks down or if mismatches start showing up on tape. On the other side, if they aggressively address those needs, if they come out of this draft with multiple defensive backs who can rotate, cover, and adapt, then suddenly this defense starts to look deeper, faster, and more unpredictable. And that's when you begin to see the identity they're trying to build actually take shape on the field. But don't overlook the internal competition this is going to create. That might be one of the most important parts of this entire process. Because when you bring in versatile players, you're not just filling roles, you're creating battles. Who plays in the slot? Who rotates deep? Who handles man coverage in critical situations? Those answers won't be decided on paper. They'll be earned every single day in practice. And that kind of competition can elevate an entire unit. It forces players to expand their skill sets. It forces coaches to get creative, and it gives the defense options, which is something every coordinator values when game planning week to week. At the same time, there's always risk involved. Relying on flexibility means you're asking players to do more, and that can lead to mistakes if the execution isn't sharp. One missed assignment, one hesitation, and it can turn into a big play for the offense. So the margin for error becomes smaller, even as the potential upside grows. That's why this approach, if that's truly the direction the Steelers are taking, requires everything to be aligned. Coaching, communication, player development, it all has to come together. Because if it does, you're looking at a defense that can adjust to anything, disguise intentions, and keep offenses guessing. But if it doesn't, it can look inconsistent and vulnerable. And this is where you, as a fan, really start to feel the impact, because every game, every snap, you'll be watching not just for results, but for how this vision is being executed. Are players moving seamlessly across roles? Are they communicating pre-snap? Are they reacting instead of hesitating? That's what's going to define whether this strategy works or not. So as we get closer to the draft and everything starts to take shape, keep this in mind. It's not just about filling needs. It's about building a system that can survive in today's NFL. And every decision from here on out is a step toward that goal. And the deeper you go into this, the more you realize that what the Steelers are doing isn't loud. It isn't flashy, but it's very intentional. Every move, every visit, every conversation is building towards something that might not